Imagine a fence that is more than 5,000 kilometers long, standing in the Australian wilderness. Many people even call it the longest structure in the world. Doesn't it sound incredible? Once upon a time, people actually used to joke about this long fence. For example, in 2015, a TV program said that Australia must be unemployed. So they are spending their time by building thousands of kilometers of fences in the middle of the desert. Someone called it the bizarre idea of building a national chicken coop. But 10 years later, no one is laughing anymore. Because in the terrible drought of the whole country, this fence has now become the only hope of Australian farmers. That fence is now deciding which animals will live and which animals will die and which farms will survive. Currently, in the midst of a terrible drought, this fence in Australia has become the last light of hope for farmers. So, the Australian government is forced to collect additional taxes from the people to maintain this fence. It is like a war to protect a fence. Otherwise, the whole of Australia will turn into a desert. Today we will know the dramatic story of Australia's dingo fence or wild dog control, which started with ridicule, but how it ended up saving the entire nation and creating history. This story begins even earlier, with an incident that happened on a Christmas day in the early 19th century. On Christmas Day in 1859, in the Australian state of Victoria, a traveling landowner named Thomas Austin released only 24 European rabbits on his land to play hunting. The idea was that he would have fun by hunting some, but who knew that this entertainment would change the fate of the entire Australian soil? Within a few years, those rabbits started breeding and spreading at a reckless rate in the surrounding area. Within 20 years, they started spreading across the entire continent like an epidemic. These rabbits started entering new areas at a rate of about 60 kilometers every year. They were not eating grass little by little, but were completely destroying vast deserts. They were destroying grain fields. And Australia's main export, wool, which is made from sheep's hair, has also seen its production plummet due to the loss of grass. Farmers are left in despair. Wherever you look, it's full of rabbits. And the fields are disappearing into the ground. A few decades later, it was seen that millions of rabbits were really running around in Australia. And everything was completely destroyed. And to stop this plague of rabbits, the state government of Western Australia took extreme measures. In the 1890s, an incredible construction project began. Thousands of kilometers of wire fences were laid across the desert. That gigantic fence was built after almost a decade of effort. It was called a rabbit-proof fence. This fence, built with tarpaulins under the ground and some land cleared on both sides of the fence, began to exclude the breeding of rabbits. However, despite all this, some clever rabbits were moving to the other side through the gaps. The fence was not completely successful. In the end, science had to be used as a tool. In 1950, researchers spread a deadly disease virus among rabbits. And their numbers began to decline rapidly. Although some rabbits later survived the disease. This virus war and fencing together saved much of the country's pastures and crops. Later calculations showed that the rabbit fence and other measures together saved Australia billions of dollars in damage, which is several times more than the cost of building the fence. Australia learned two lessons from this incident. First, the spread of invasive animals is faster than any man-made fence. Because before the last pole was installed, the rabbits had crossed a long distance. Second, once their fence became an economic bulwark, it became almost impossible to remove it. If it was removed, the next drought or insect or disease could end it all again. So even though the rabbit infestation decreased, that huge fence remained intact, and this time that wire fence was targeted to suppress the Australian wild dog dingo. Australia's war with the dingo or dwarf dog began in the early 1900s. Because suddenly the price of the famous wool in Australia started to fall. And the reason for this was that wild dogs killed 10% of the sheep in Australia. Here, wild dogs are basically dengue. The native wild dogs of Australia, which look like domestic dogs, are actually fierce predators. Farmers were gradually realizing that their attacks were not funny. A farmer woke up one morning and found 30 sheep lying dead on his farm overnight. Only one dengue had come and caused such a havoc. Every spring, it was seen that at least one sheep out of every 10 sheep was lost, or they are found dead in the hands of dingoes. But this was not a laughing matter at all to those whose flocks of sheep were dying out like this. As a result, in 1914, the government again chose the old method. The old method of separating the dingoes by erecting wire fences with poles. Again, a surveyor was asked to build a fence as far as possible towards the southwest. A desperate construction began. Many people fled midway through the desert mountains and rivers in the scorching heat, yet the rest continued to finish the impossible task by pulling the wire over the rocks and cutting through the forest. In 1958, the 5,614-meter-long fence was completed. Yes, this is the world's longest continuous fence. The design of this fence is also very strict. The wire mesh wall is about 6 feet high. Additional wire skirts are buried in the ground so that no one can make a hole. A few meters of space on both sides of the fence are kept completely clear so that there is no chance of hiding. The only purpose is to prevent dingoes from entering the sheep farm area at all. Maintaining this long fence was no less difficult. About 23 patrol officers are constantly monitoring and repairing this fence across the three-state border. Still, accidents sometimes happen. For example, in June 2024, a few dingoes broke through the fence at one place on the New South Wales border in Queensland. The next morning, 34 sheep were found dead in one night. Many sheep were lying injured. In one night, a gang of dingoes wiped out half a farmer's income for the year. And for this, farmers are even willing to pay a small tax for each sheep. Because this tax is nothing compared to the damage that will be caused by a gap. The government has also made laws. The punishment for leaving the fence gate open or cutting the fence can be up to a prison sentence. Because this fence is not just a few wires and poles. It is like the protection of the entire Australian agricultural sector. But one question remains. If the top predator is thus driven out of half the country, how will nature respond? To see the answer, you can understand it by looking at both sides of the fence. On the east side, which is a dengue-free area, the desert soil is pale, dry and lifeless. And on the west side of the fence is the dingo kingdom. It has a much greener hue than the desert. This stark contrast is clearly visible from satellite images. Because dingoes live on the west side, they do not allow herbivores, including kangaroos, to stay in one place for long. Due to the absence of dingoes, the number of red kangaroos on the east side is increasing. They sit in one place without fear and chew up all the grass around them. The seedlings of small trees are destroyed before they can grow. As a result, the soil is completely empty. During the dry season, that dust rises and turns into a terrible dust storm, which turns the sky red even in the city. Due to the absence of dingoes, the foxes of the eastern coast are also growing unhindered. They are killing the eggs and chicks of the birds that nest in the ground. As a result, many small birds and animals are almost extinct in that region. Yet, despite all this, the dingo fence still stands as the main hope for protecting Australia's agricultural economy. Scientists are still planning more carefully to deal with the environmental problems caused by the sheep. so that this balance can be maintained in the future. However, no one is thinking of completely removing this huge fence. Because everyone knows how terrible the consequences can be if it is removed. The amazing thing is that the plan that everyone once dismissed